there's certainly an economic aspect to it. There's certainly environmental aspect to it. There's a disruptive aspect to it. There's a whole bunch of things that make it make sense for us.
Welcome to Flying BC, a podcast about the people, planes, and aviation adventures in British Columbia and Canada, with your host, Warwick Patterson.
Welcome to episode 10 of Flying British Columbia. As an aspiring floatplane pilot and a fan of technology and business, today's guest is someone I've been angling to talk to since this project started. I sat down recently with Greg McDougall, founder and CEO of Harbour Air, mainly to discuss the electric Beaver project that first took to the air almost a year ago, and the challenges and opportunities ahead. But first, we look back on the journey through his rough and tumble bush flying years, and the start of Harbour Air nearly 40 years ago with just 2 Beavers. The company now flies over 40 aircraft and transports nearly 500,000 passengers a year, making them an iconic sight on the coast of British Columbia. If you're a fan of the show, please leave a review on Spotify or iTunes or wherever you listen, and share it with your friends on social media. The audience is growing every episode, and your shares really help. So strap on your life jacket, and let's dive into the world of floatplanes with Greg McDougall. All right. Can you tell us a little bit how you got into aviation? You told me a little story the other day of how you used to be at the lake and you'd see floatplanes.
Yeah. So I spent all my summers at a sort of remote cabin up the coast that my family used as a summer cabin. And although we went in by, it's actually an island on a lake on an island in the ocean. So, quite sort of remote for logistically. And although close to the Sunshine Coast. So float planes used to come in and out. And I remember being a little kid there and watching these planes coming in and out and kind of got, I guess, maybe it's almost a genetic thing. You kind of attracted to it or you're not, and I was. And one of the pilots used to come in and out, took me for a ride. I think I was about 6 years old, and then it was kind of like set in my mind as to what I wanted to do. And I think in my mind at that time, not maybe at that time, but sort of growing up, it was like a mixture of, okay, it's a lifestyle plus a profession plus a whatever. But I just knew that, that flying, particularly seaplanes, float planes, was what I wanted to do. So as soon as I got out of high school, we lived in California. I had dual citizenship. My parents were both Canadian. They were working down there. And as soon as I got out of high school, I just went to Pitt Meadows, took my flight training, and just worked at it every day, kind of thing. And I think I probably had it done to commercial in maybe 2.5 months, something like that. And luckily, interestingly, I met a guy. Well, he actually gave me my seaplane endorsement, my float plane endorsement. And in those days, it was like the 5-hour float plane endorsement, and you're kind of somewhat good to go. But we struck up a bit of a relationship, and so he decided that I should. He was like starting his sort of float plane training business and charter business, and he decided that I was good enough to kind of train or mentor or whatever into a position where I could actually do something. So my first job was actually giving seaplane ratings at, I had to get 50 hours on type to be able to do that. So I just went out and flew around for 50 hours. And then I started giving seaplane ratings. And if I think back about that now, it's, the blind leading the blind. But anyways, then I started flying charters up and down the coast. And a Cessna 180, I think, was the first plane I flew that was of any sort of commercial sort of size. And it was pretty interesting times because in those days it still was very much the Wild West. You flew basically in terrible weather with overloaded airplanes, and the good pilot was the guy that got you there on the day that nobody else would. The whole culture was just completely bad, safety-wise. And Then I went up to Fort Simpson and got another job up there working at a Fort Simpson in the Northwest Territories, and continued on with that whole kind of bush pilot, thing. It's amazing, really, looking back, that I survived it. I mean, the amount of stuff that we did that was really sketchy. And it was, I remember saying to my boss one day there that the weather was pretty dicey, and I had to do a medevac over to Yellowknife from Fort Simpson, which was a fairly long flight across the tundra, and the weather was really low. And I said, as a very inexperienced pilot, I said, well, it's kind of beyond my comfort zone. And he said, well, if you don't do the trip, I have to do it. And if I do the trip, I don't need you, and you'll be on the next plane back to Vancouver. So when you think about that safety culture and how that was prevalent through pretty much the entire industry at that time, and you really, I mean, that's reverse safety culture. That's basically putting, pilots in a position where they either have to go out and do things that they're comfortable with to maintain their job, or economic issues or whatever. So really, the fact that in those days the business was fairly dangerous. I mean, there was a lot of accidents that happened from people just pushing stuff and relying on luck, and eventually your luck will probably run out. So when I started the business, I think I came into it kind of almost with that same bush pilot mentality. And the result of that was that we did have some accidents, and I remembered that there was one accident in particular that we had that was really quite devastating, and there was loss of life and everything else. And I went, well, there has to be a better way than this. Like, if you analyze what happened there, and in terms of the applied pressure, this was out of Prince Rupert. All the accidents we had were basically in the north coast, or the accidents that we did have, and if you analyze, well, could we have done things better to make sure that this didn't happen, and put this pilot in a position where he felt he had to, sort of go and try and complete a mission that was probably in conditions that weren't, certainly ideal, to put it mildly. And the answer was clearly, that we could have done things a lot differently. And so I came to this kind of a, epiphany or whatever it is, that we had to take safety culture and turn it completely 180 degrees from where it was to, to sort of use a bit of a analogy or euphemism, whatever. The pilots in the old days in the bar at night would get patted on the back for going out and taking chances. And almost overnight, we had to change it to, not only will you not get patted on the back for taking chances, you'll get fired. And that was a, very dramatic shift in the whole, thinking of how you would go out and conduct this business, because everybody was competing against one another and doing things to try and get a one-up on the other guy, and charging not enough money, and there was everything just crazy. And so we just said, well, we're not doing that anymore. And amazingly enough, not surprisingly, the accidents stopped. I mean, touch wood. And customers started gravitating towards us that were more of the government-oriented customers, et cetera. And I think that the vision in those days was, for me, and I don't know if I consciously sort of thought about it, but it was to take a very unsophisticated, product or industry and make it sophisticated enough that people felt comfortable using it as a regular sort of, transportation conveyance. And I guess fast forward to today, mission accomplished. I mean, people use float planes on the coast as they would a ferry or a bus or a taxi or a, whatever. and it's just another method of transportation, and people put their kids on it. They use it for all walks of life. And for me, that's a very satisfying thing to see that people have that confidence in the product and in the business we've created. And they should, because, it is safe. We've made it safe, and it's now something that people can certainly trust.
Yeah, the Harbour Air float planes are kind of a staple of people who live around here. It's like, oh yeah, it's another float plane.
Yeah.
So for those who don't live around here, you started, what was it, mid-'80s, something like that? And then
82, yeah.
And you started with one plane, or how did you?
Yeah, so we had, like, what happened, of course, if for those people that can think back to 82, about, what was going on then, the economy took a huge dive. And I was working for a land development company at the time that had a couple of airplanes, King Air and a Beaver, and basically flew those for the executives of the land development company. And most of my flying was flying people around to go fishing and partying and having a good time, back and forth to Reno and Vegas and whatever. And then all of a sudden, boom, overnight, and it wasn't equivalent to what happened with COVID recently, but it was pretty devastating. The interest rates shot up, everything kind of collapsed. And, the party was over for those guys that didn't have a lot of depth. And the guys that I was working for certainly didn't. They were kind of just, running on borrowed money and whatever. So overnight, they couldn't afford their airplanes anymore. And I basically said to them, they actually had a dock down in Vancouver Harbour, attached to a barge down there. It was their office barge, and there was a dock there. So there was a dock. There was we're right in the heart. Actually, it's right where the convention center is now, ironically. And so this barge was there. The dock was there. There was fuel. There was everything. And I said, well, I know you can't afford me anymore, so I'll lease your plane and your dock, and and pay something for that, and relieve you of the burden of my salary, and I'll go and start a seaplane airline. So there was another guy actually who was in the same position, working for a logging company, and he had a Beaver. So I took the Beaver that they had, and he brought another Beaver, and so two Beavers, and we started Harbour Air, and this is a lot of sort of interest. Well, it's detailed, but in those days there was perceived base protection everywhere, so you couldn't actually just go somewhere freely and start, because you had an AOC and operating certificate. You couldn't just go and run out of Vancouver Harbour. You had to have theoretically a license to actually operate from there. And so our license was based out in Pitt Meadows, Port Kells, which is right across from Pitt Meadows, because that's where the logging company was that my partner was working from, and he was the one that had obtained this license. But lo and behold, we discovered by examining the regulations that the definition of a base was within 25 miles of the post office of the base that your geographical location. And of course, Vancouver Harbour fell just within that 25-mile radius. And so we positioned there, and of course, West Coast Air was there, and Air West and whatever. And they had a panic attack because somebody was coming in and just like a gypsy sort of thing and operating. So they tried to get us shut down, and they were somewhat successful in harassing us because the RCMP were kind of the people that were supposed to enforce all this, and they didn't understand the regulations. But fortunately, we had a consultant that was, very up on exactly, what this loophole was. And so, we set precedent with that. And people discovered that base protection actually didn't exist it existed beyond 25 miles of the post office. So early days, very difficult, operating a couple of airplanes, doing everything, dispatching ourselves and doing the full deal and running under those old sort of safety, the old safety culture, which was challenging for sure.
So now, almost 40 years later, where does Harbour Air stand now? You've got
Well,
a lot of planes. And
yeah, so we've got 40 some odd aircraft, and pre-COVID we were running with close to 80 pilots, carrying around 450,000 people a year. So big business, and it kind of grew very organically. There was sort of mileposts along the way in terms of what drove the business. I mean, and our first customers were all pretty much resource based, so it was all logging, forest industry involved mostly, and then very little tourism in the province at that time, and then the World's Exposition 1986, I believe it was, kind of turned on the whole. Here's tourism all of a sudden, and then the fishing camps started opening up. So there was fishing resorts, and we sort of tapped into that business. So there was always this sort of ebb and flow, and as the resource based business sort of trickled off because forest industry started getting much more kind of condensed, and so we weren't flying into the logging camps as much because the camps became contract, and because the big sort of camps didn't work anymore so much. Then it was all about flying log buyers around to look at logs and specialty sort of export of logs, and flying people around that were looking at the floating logs in different areas. So we specialized in that. And that kind of tapered off. The sports fishing business came along. So summer was like, the big deal, and we'd have to cram it all into the summer. And then winter, we would basically be, trying to conserve the cash we'd made in the summer, and sometimes not so well. So it was really seasonal, very difficult business. Then I guess the sort of the major, sort of big shift was when we bought, Jimmy Pattison had basically gone out and wanted to create AirBC, and bought all of these licenses on the coast. He bought West Coast Air, he bought AirBC or Air West, he bought, all these different licenses, and wanted to create a regional airline. And he did that, and then discovered that, sort of the seaplane end of it, the float plane end of it, really wasn't conducive to what they were about. They were more about regional carrier, flying turboprop aircraft, and so really the float planes didn't fit into the whole picture. So sort of softly they put all the float plane assets on the market. There was about 9 aircraft. There was the base on the river at YVR, which was basically ATCO Trailers at that time, the place now that occupied by the Flying Beaver, that we bar and restaurant, which is our terminal, which was built by us, and so the hangar, the sort of legacy hangar at the airport, and the base on the river at the airport, and then rights to use the dock downtown, which was a big deal because the dock that we originally used had all been sort of swept away, or was going to be, and for the future development of the convention center, which took years before they actually did anything. But in any event, we couldn't stay in that spot, but we did have access to the RBC dock downtown as long as we didn't compete with them. So we were able to run charters out of there and Gulf Island schedule, I think, but nothing else. So anyways, we bought these aircraft. It was a bunch of Beavers, I think, and maybe a couple of single otter Pistons, and that kind of turned us all of a sudden into this much larger carrier. But when I think about, the sort of the underpinnings of what we were operating all that equipment with, I mean, we didn't really have a lot of management structure, and it was pretty crazy times. Cash was a big issue, and getting support from banks and all that was really difficult. So there was a lot of scraping and scrounging and, robbing Peter to pay Paul, and, trying to keep the airplanes airworthy and, all of that. So that was a difficult thing. But anyways, I mean, the evolution was that as tourism came along, we grew with it. and then finally, Air BC sold their harbor service to West Coast Air, and the new sort of West Coast Air, and the non-competition agreement did not survive that. So we were able to obtain some land right next to the existing AirBC dock, or West Coast Air dock at that time, and then start up our own operation with harbor-to-harbor service. And we teamed up with Kenboric Air, which was the largest operator of Twin Otters at that time. And they were able to supply us with Twin Otters, which, on a seasonal basis, even, which was a real key key to growth and success for the company. And so, when we competed with West Coast Air, and of course, eventually we bought West Coast Air, and then, went through a whole series of different iterations of temporary facilities in the harbor, and then wound up in the convention center. And that's, of course, a whole other story. It's been an interesting evolution. And all the while, though, I think it's all been about trying to make the business more sophisticated. And although we're using older legacy aircraft, it's about trying to be very progressive and innovative about how we use them and how the systems around them work, and not only safety systems, but all of that. So you kind of fast forward to today in terms of the development of the electric aircraft and all of that. It seems kind of almost counterintuitive when we're running aircraft that are 50, 60 years old, some of them. But really, in a way, it's not. I mean, we were sort of the first to use the converted turbine otter successfully, and that was basically a retrofit. And so looking at electrification is another retrofit, and so it's natural that we would look at it. But there's a whole, there's certainly an economic aspect to it. There's certainly environmental aspect to it. There's a disruptive aspect to it. There's a whole bunch of things that make it make sense for us. And not the least of which is the fact that Harbour Air enjoys a very maybe enjoys is not the right word, but is in a unique position because of its stage lengths being so short, and also its energy use is quite low because of single engine, fairly efficient turbine aircraft. If there's, I think we're a fairly long ways off from the electrification of major transatlantic flights or anything else, because the energy density required to do that is with current technology that's even kind of in the pipeline, except for maybe the hydrogen fuel cells, is pretty far off. But there is huge evolution going on in all of that as we speak. And the more I've been involved with it, the more I realize that it's inevitable that aviation will electrify over a period of time as the technology evolves. And we're really excited to be kind of at the leading edge of the sort of pioneering of the regulation side of it, and getting it accepted by not only Transport Canada but the FAA, and be basically evolving the regulatory structure around how it's going to work, because it doesn't matter really what whether your batteries go for 2 hours or 1 hour or half an hour. The fact of the battery is you still have to prove the technology, and you have to prove that it's as safe or safer than what we're currently using. So that's kind of the trick. The whole
ecosystem around it's probably different. You need technicians who are trained in it, and systems set up around it.
And at the same time, recognizing that urban air mobility movement, which is vertical takeoff and landing, electrified aircraft, and like there's a whole bunch of people working on that as well. So you've got Uber, basically funding projects. You've got Boeing's involved, and Rolls-Royce is involved, and GE is involved, and major companies that are developing this technology. And interesting that Pratt & Whitney's kind of late to the game. They're looking now at a hybrid type of system, but the amount of money and brain power being poured into this new technology of electrifying flight is just staggering. I mean, people just aren't even aware really of how how much effort is being, both intellectually and financially is being poured into this. So it's kind of like, be a part of it or stand here and watch it. And I'm not planning on standing here and watching it.
Right. So that was kind of where I was going to go with that. Like we're now about a year since your first flight in the electric Beaver. How many years in development before that were you working on, and what instigated that?
So I guess it was kind of a natural progression in a way. And I guess there's several factors. I mean, one is that we went carbon neutral about 13, 14 years ago. And I'm proud to say today, I think we're the only carbon neutral, as far as we can see, we're the only fully carbon neutral airline in the world. And again, it's back to the short stage lengths, the fact that we can do it economically. I mean, if you offset your carbon burn with projects and carbon credits and all of that on transatlantic aircraft, well, you're adding probably hundreds of dollars to each ticket. With us, it's like $3 or $4. So it's a mandatory part of our ticket. It's actually built into every ticket, and then we offset our corporate burn as well. And so we were able to do that early, and it was not only sort of a core value of the company to be able to do that and to take the initiative to do it. But it also, certainly benefited us in a commercial way in terms of people saying, well, here's somebody actually doing something. It's not perfect because you're not, eliminating the carbon burn, but you are offsetting it with real projects that actually do demonstrably take that carbon out of the atmosphere. And that was all backed up by sustainability professors at UBC and all the rest of it. So we were, very successful with that program and proud of it. And then I became sort of, interested in electrical power, I guess. Well, for one thing, I, flying like RC electric aircraft, and the power to weight ratio is unbelievable. And not that, it scales completely like that, but then I was one of the first Tesla owners in Vancouver. Was just amazed with the sophistication of that technology and how it worked right off the bat and how it was going to work, and could certainly see the future of the electrification of transportation in general and cars and AI and everything else that I just became kind of a student of it, and so I started thinking about how would we how can we participate in the evolution of it? And we started sort of tinkering with the idea, and we talked to a few people that, had electrified different buses and different, things. And there was a guy in Victoria that we talked to who was electrifying some buses, and he was also an aviation buff. So he kind of said, look, I've already done the math on this. It works. I can show you how it works. So we were looking at that, and I think I had him prepare a report on sort of the feasibility of it, and we were kind of scratching our heads because it looked like it was going to be a huge investment, and to kind of take it from this very rudimentary, there's a motor over there and there's some batteries, but to take it through certification and all that. So we're just trying to scratch in our heads, trying to figure out how to do that. And in walked Magniex, who's the company that produces the motors exclusively for aviation. And we had some talks with Siemens and some other organizations that had developed motors for aviation, but they were kind of on to bigger and better things. But Magniex walked in and said, "Look, we want to be the first commercial, propulsion system or propulsion system for a commercial aircraft." And you guys had stated, in whatever press or wherever it was, that we wanted to be the first, commercial airline in the world to operate electric aircraft. So our interests are aligned, and we're prepared to financially back this to be able to do it. And I kind of went, okay. I remember we had a coffee in our office, and in 15 minutes we were shaking hands and saying, okay, let's do it. We don't know how we're going to do it. We're going to do it. And so away we went, and they sent up a team, and I had, sort of our team and their team, and it was a really interesting process to watch, because you kind of had the geeks, and then you had our wrench twisters, and they kind of integrated into this unit of figuring out how to do this. And basically it took about, from sort of, that having that coffee in the office to actually flying the plane, I think was about 9 months, something like that.
Oh, wow, that quickly.
Yeah, 9-10 months maybe. So very quick when it comes to, sort of anything to do with aerospace. And we, I remember how much sort of interest there was, right off the bat when we started talking about it. And then when we started saying, okay, we're actually going to do it, and how much attention we were getting over it, and how people kind of twigged to this, and they kind of went, wow, this is a pretty big deal. And for me, it actually kind of caught me by surprise at how many people kind of internationally even started paying attention to this. And of course, it all culminated with the actual flight, which I did in the Beaver, electric Beaver. I think it was December 8th or something. Can't remember, but at that point, we really did have whipped up quite a frenzy of interest, and there was a lot of pressure for that flight, because it was kind of like, bit of a
You kind of always want to make the first flight just secret.
Yeah, well, we kind of did, actually. Yeah. So we did actually take the plane out in sort of the break of dawn, I think a few days before we actually did the Tada flight. Although we couldn't actually fly it. We could kind of do a couple of test liftoffs and kind of set back down again, straight ahead kind of thing. Transport. We had to do all of this under transport permit, of course.
Yeah. And the fact that you got that done in 9 months is pretty impressive.
Exactly. Yeah. There was a real alignment of effort from the regulatory side and everybody, sort of political side, whatever, realizing that this was something important. And so the way really did get quite paved in terms of, there was still lots of scrutiny over everything, but it was at least doable. And because a lot of people, pulled the cart in the same direction, and there wasn't kind of, crazy kind of, well, you got to go off and do 3 months of, research on this particular point or whatever. So yeah, there was a big, amount of interest, and when I actually did the flight, and there were all these people on the banks of the river, and it was really quite astonishing. And we did the big press conference afterwards, and then we got interviewed by a lot of international press, and it was a significant moment. I mean, basically what we proved was that we could ostensibly fly a commercial aircraft electrically, and the numbers, if not worked on that. So that prototype actually took off at gross weight with just me in it, because the batteries were so heavy. But that's kind of, the reason the batteries were so heavy is because they were of sort of aerospace quality, which means that there was a lot of safety built into them, and they were used on space stations and whatever, and they were old technology, basically. So they were very heavy, but still, that they were the safest sort of avenue to use. And now today, we've just made a deal with a battery supplier that's got batteries that are of aviation quality that are double the density, energy density. It's all about this watt hours per kilogram thing is the scale they use. They're double the watt hours per kilogram at the cellular level, and so that's a game changer for certainly for our it takes our prototype, which is heavy and kind of just getting through the regulatory side, to if we were today given the regulatory blessing, we could actually fly that aircraft with paying passengers and do it economically, although at a limited, it wouldn't be taking them for an hour flight, it would be taking them for a half an hour flight. So that's a big change already in the time that we've been, kind of doing this. And that was kind of one of the things we realized early, was there was so much evolution happening from the technical side of this, that during the regulatory side being completed, that when we get to that finish line, it's going to be a whole different game in terms of the propulsion system. Well, the motors would probably be very much the same, because they're actually their technology, the brushless motor, and they're quite simple, and they the power they produce is astonishing, and the simplicity of the motor is amazing. I mean, compared to a Pratt & Whitney PT6, which runs at 800 degrees Celsius with all these moving parts and coatings and everything else, and they're very expensive. And you've got this simple motor, which basically is a couple of bearings and some windings and magnets, and
I was thinking about that the other day. The original engine in the Beaver, the Wasp or Wasp Junior or whatever it is, was like designed in the 20s.
Yeah.
And now you're putting an electric motor on this thing 100 years later.
Yeah.
It's pretty incredible.
Yeah. No, it is. And really that kind of gets into this whole economic side of it, which is not only you not burning, carbon combustion fuel, but you're also not having to subject the motor you're running to all this heat and wear and tear, and so notionally, it's Magniacs is kind of like, again, they're in the prototype stage to a certain degree, but they're thinking currently that sort of notionally the time life of these motors is kind of like, well, they picked a 10,000 hour time life because it could be 20,000, but they had to pick something. And so they picked 10,000 and they're very confident it's not less than that.
Yeah. They'll outlast the airframes. Huh?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So, when you think about the economics of that, that's a game changer. I mean, we would, over that 10,000 hours, invest literally millions of dollars in a PT6 to keep it going. Not only initial purchase, but whatever. So, plus the fact that you're burning all that fuel. So that's economically a big difference.
So take us through that day, the day you flew it for the first time. Did it just fly like a Beaver?
In a way. So I've got about 8,000 hours in a piston Beaver. More recently, I'm flying turbo Beaver, which is a much better experience. But the piston Beaver, although it's an amazing aircraft, if you and the way it was designed, I mean, in terms of its sort of utility and how it was actually built as an aircraft, that the little things that people don't know about, the 45-gallon drum fits exactly through the door, right? And the floor is hardened floor, and seats pop in and out easily, and it was actually built as I think it was sort of revolutionary that de Havilland went around and actually asked people what they wanted to see in an aircraft, and the operators that were flying these, Founds and all these other weird aircraft, so it was purpose built, and it's very balanced controls. It's it stole performance, all of those things. But if you have one big fault with a piston Beaver is the fact that it's not very aerodynamic. It's not super slippery. And it's also, because you have big round engine sticking out the front, not very aerodynamic, and its power to weight when it's loaded, and then the weight distribution is an issue because although the airframe is capable of supporting a lot of weight, it doesn't do it in a very efficient way. It flies like a doorstop. So right away, when you put the electric motor on it, you now have closer to what we have on the Turbo Beaver or the Turbo Otter. It's a much more aerodynamic nose, and so you've taken away that sort of blunt obstruction, a drag obstruction. But also, of course, there's way more torque in the engine. So although, as I said, we were right at gross weight, it performed, I would say probably comparatively, it was the same as being in a very light Turbo Beaver. So amazing performance. And I didn't get to really, that day, sort of explore too much of the performance factors because it was kind of all about getting around a circuit and getting back. And with all these people lined up on the bank, you didn't want to give any chances of anything going wrong, or sort of expose yourself to more chances of things going wrong. So it was a brief flight, but nonetheless, I did, where I thought I should lift off, because it was all kind of choreographed as to where we thought we wanted to lift off, for, the cameras and people to be able to see what was going on. It was going to lift off way before that. So I actually had to pull power back to keep it on the water to lift off at the proper spot. Great performance, with the caveat that it was at gross weight. Since then, one of my other, actually our vice president of operations, who's also a very skilled test pilot, has been doing most of the flights, since then, and I'm actually going to go back to start flying some of the other flights that are with the new batteries and that, because I want to get a sense of exactly what we can do with that in a sort of evolution of those batteries. So no, it was an exciting day. It was I guess the moment when I kind of came back and went into the dock and all these people were cheering and yelling, and it was really quite overwhelming in terms of how much attention was being paid to this on that day, and but gratifying too, that okay, we kind of made a bet here, and people get it, right? And so they believe that what we're doing here is real and has validity and all of that. It's not just us dreaming about stuff; it's real, right?
Yeah.
So that was important.
You had some naysayers. I was surprised at some of the aviation industry news as well, saying, "Wow, this is just you can't really do it." What do you say to those people who are like? Well,
I enjoyed that, and I have to tell you, this is launching off into all these little stories, but I was very honored to be inducted into the Canadian Aviation Hall of Fame, and that was all of that process was post anything to do with electrifying aviation. So it was purely on the fact that we had built this airline and the safety culture and all of those things. And so I was very, very honored. I'm not normally a person that looks for spotlights, and but that was a great honor. And so there was an event at the Bombardier hangar in Quebec, and they had a dinner, like a big dinner with all of these. I think it was 500 people there. It was a black tie thing and bagpipers and all the whatever. And so at that dinner, there was all of these, I would call it pretty traditional aviation aristocracy of Canada. I don't know how to term it, but
right.
Pretty
the who's who of aviation.
Yeah. So there was a lot of Transport Canada people. There was politicians. There was, Bombardier execs. There was Pratt and Whitney execs. There was, there was kind of the establishment of the aviation community, and most of them, not a lot of young people actually. There was a lot of older people, and there was a lot of military there as well. So we had to make an acceptance speech. I think it was maybe 10, 15 minutes or something that each of us had to do. And Barry Lapointe, my good friend and mentor, Barry from Kelowna Flightcraft, was being honored at the same time, which made it a lot more fun. But anyways, so I got up in front of this audience, and I'm looking out at this sea of, gray hair, and well, I shouldn't say that. There was young people there too, but anyways, a very sort of staid audience, and basically the speech I made was, thank you very much for this amazing honor. However, I didn't say it's premature, but I said I think my contribution to aviation in Canada and possibly the world in terms of is yet to come, because I'm doing this electrification project. And so I sort of briefly, and I remember looking out at these people, and they just kind of looked at me like, what the hell is he talking about? Like, I even heard some harumphing from the back of the room or whatever. So
from the Pratt and Whitney guy, probably.
Yeah, well, interesting. I'll tell an interesting story about that. But so after the event was, as it was breaking up, these people came up to me, and there was sort of this steady succession of people congratulating me, but some of them were saying, good luck with that kind of thing. And I, I'm the kind of person that I don't take that as being in any way, kind of negative. I think it makes it a lot more interesting that you have something to prove, and the fact that I totally believe in what it is we're doing, and so it's kind of like, well, we'll see about that kind of thing, right? So so that was interesting. But the Pratt and Whitney guys came up and said, could you guys come to the factory tomorrow, you and your executive, whoever wants to come, and we'd like to have a little session in the boardroom with you, and talk about what's going on, and what you're doing and whatever. I said, sure. So we did that the next day, and that was pretty interesting, because it was all about, well, they had their engineering guys there and whatever, and they asked a lot of questions, and I thought, here's this rinky-dink little airline, and in the grand scheme of things, how many of the PT6s do we have? Well, we have a few, but why would they even really be concerned about this? But they saw the fact that they should be, and they should be, and so they asked a lot of questions. At the end of the day, I said, well, so what are you guys doing about this? And they said, well, we have this hybrid program and different things that was still on the board, on the boards, but it's not. We're trying to get it going and whatever. But GE, Rolls-Royce, Airbus, name them. They're all heavily involved.
They have to be, don't they? Yeah,
they have to be.
Yeah.
So yeah, naysayers, absolutely, and bring it on.
It was. I think it was the surprising thing to me was saying, well, the battery technology is not there. They can't do this. And but it's proving a point, right?
Yeah.
Is that obviously that's why you kind of did it, was just like, let's prove this technology, see if we can do it.
But the battery technology is, as we speak, is evolving amazingly. I mean, this new deal that we're doing with this battery company has it's a chemical change in lithium battery that basically does two things. It changes the energy density to double, but at the same time, it deals with all of the volatility in the charging and the issues with the combustion and all that. So it's a game changer right there. But we're only a few months from the initial flight, and already there's game changing technology, and we know that that's happening in fuel cells and everything else. I mean, people are toiling away in all these different laboratories all over the world, and there's test flights being done. I read about one in Europe the other day over the fuel cell, and so it's just happening, right? And
so you mentioned like we focus on the plane's ability to hold the batteries and power it, but I guess there's probably a challenge on some of the islands, like building charging stations and getting power to those too. Is that something you're working on?
Yeah, we're working with BC Hydro on that, and the charging infrastructure is an issue. There are workarounds. We can't, we can't change the batteries per se. Probably certainly in the Beaver, or we're still sort of debating Caravan and Turbine Otter, but swapping out batteries is difficult because they have to be pretty much built into the airframe. But what you can do, and one of the things about lithium is that as long as you can control the heat, you can pretty much put amperage in like it's as big as your fire hose is, as big as your hose is in terms of amperage. You can bombard that battery with amperage. That's how the superchargers work for Tesla, right? They up the amperage and crank it in, and they control the heat, so they can basically they can triple the charging efficiency. So that's the same for the aircraft, and so the trick is to get that amperage down to a point where you can charge the aircraft. However, if you can't do that, you can charge another fuel cell, and then or battery bank, and then transfer that energy from that battery bank into the one onboard one. So you effectively you have and then you take that battery bank and charge it while the aircraft's out flying, and then because it's presumably doing a round trip.
So you could have almost like a fuel tank.
Yeah, exactly.
At each spot.
Exactly. So for more remote locations or locations where you don't yet have the infrastructure, you can do it that way.
You could have a rescue plane with one in it to go if you had to go to an alternate or something.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's just kind of one example of what you can do. But I think that there's certainly realization by BC Hydro even has a department sort of working with this, that this whole electrification thing of transportation is a big deal, and aviation is one aspect of it. So how does their grid handle it, and how do you get the amperage, right? And the other thing to note about BC in particular is that that all of our energy comes from hydro, from dams and water, and so there is no coal being burnt or carbon producing fuel for that. So it truly is clean power.
Yeah, that puts your airline in a unique position for sure. Yeah. If it suddenly scaled up globally, I think we'd be there'd be a lot of dirty power creating clean power.
It's an issue, but it's an offset too.
Yeah,
between the combustion engine and the electrification. So,
does the noise footprint change with a electric? Because the prop is where most noise comes from, right?
Well, on takeoff, so that a certain percentage of the noise is it comes from the propeller and the supersonic sort of tip speed. So there's a percentage of that noise, but there's also due to the torque of the electric motor, it now sort of leads you into propeller designs that are different and probably don't have to go supersonic like that. So it can reduce that part. But the actual noise in flight is pretty much nothing. It's wind noise, and so and a bit of propeller noise. But the cruising sort of aspect of which some people take issue with when planes flying over their head is down to incrementally, probably 20% of what you would have normally. So there's a big reduction there, and of course inside the aircraft it's a lot quieter. But yeah, it's a lot quieter for sure.
And so where you're not even a year from first flight, what's the future a couple of years hold, and where do you see electric really coming into play for your airline?
So, as we've kind of already covered, I think the actual regulatory process is the major uncharted territory here, and although there is certainly a collective sort of willingness to get this done, politically and sort of bureaucracy wise, and people that are very positive about getting this done. The fact of the matter is there are goalposts along the way, and not the least of which is proving the safety of all of this. And so, that is a bit of a, I wouldn't say that that it's something without, that it's infinite, but it's not. But we don't know exactly, what sort of how much do the goalposts get moved down the field as we go along, and so
the technology could move faster than the regulations.
Yeah. So that really is the bet, and I think that even we keep talking about a 2-year process. So when I say 2 years, and our engineers kind of look at me and kind of go, yeah, that's kind of a best case scenario. But they don't know either, because they certainly know that the technology can be proven, but they don't know what the sort of process is going to be, because there is no process. I mean, basically we're operating under the STC process, so standard type certificate, and so because there really isn't any design process for this, because it's so different. But that's the closest thing that they have, and so that's fine. There is a process, but the process will be altered in terms of what are the goalpost parameters on the way along. So we don't know exactly how long that process will be, but we do know that the technology continues to evolve, and there are others. We're not the only people working on this. So there are others in the process in different ways, and a lot of it is from clean sheet aircraft and whatever. But there's a lot of people moving in the same direction, and the FAA actually is quite far out in front regulatory wise in terms of identifying a specific process for electrification of aviation, and they have a whole group working on it. So there is bilateral too, right? So we can kind of piggyback off of what's going on in the FAA, but as a Canadian airline, and very proud of the Canadian heritage in development of aerospace, we'd like it to remain sort of the purely Canadian initiative in terms of getting this first kind of paying customer in an electric aircraft, because we think that's achievable.
Yeah. So you think sort of 5 years, maybe?
And people always say, well, your goal is to electrify your whole fleet. Well, yeah, ultimately, but the reality of that is based on the technology and how quickly it develops. Because right now we can see that if, as I said before, if we were sort of granted the ability to carry paying passengers tomorrow, we could do it. But they would be, short stage lengths and light loads. But you can still do something with that. But to evolve our whole fleet to, our longest scheduled destination is Seattle. Hopefully we can fly again soon. And for the energy sort of density to come up to be able to do that, it may be a ways off. So the fleet will evolve with the technology in terms of that. But our goal would be, certainly to become completely electric at some point. So that's, that's certainly the goal, and we'll just keep working towards it.
I hope you enjoyed that discussion with Greg, and I don't know about you, but I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens with electric aircraft in the coming years. Nothing will replace the sound of an inertia starter spooling up on a radial Pratt & Whitney, but there are exciting times ahead nonetheless. Please follow me on Instagram and Facebook at Flying British Columbia, and you can find past episodes, videos, and ways to support the show at flyingbc.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the air.